Good evening, everyone. It's really an honor to be here and spend this time and talk about this very important event. And it's an important event not only here in the city of Boston, but certainly for fire protection professionals around the world, as well as others in medical community, legal community, and elsewhere. So we want to talk about this fire, and I'm hoping that as we go through this evening, we can really share some of the stories that you have as well. As Stephanie mentioned, we'll be having time after to have some of those comments, and we certainly look for some of that feedback because there are a lot of stories. I've heard a lot, but I'd certainly like to hear a lot more. Now, before I dive right into this presentation, I want to point out even what I'm using as my title slides in each of the sections that I'll be talking about. I'm showing 4 books that you see here, and the reason for that is back in 2007 we did a session at the NFPA annual meeting when it was held in Boston that year, and we brought together these authors that you see that wrote these books here, Stephanie Chereau, Charlie Kenny, Barbara Ravage, and John Esposito. And in addition, Billy Noonan, who's here with us, was part of our group, and also Jack Deedy and myself and John Hall from NFPA. And we put together this session, and what I'm pointing out here is that there's a lot of different people that have a lot of different angles on this fire, and no one of us, I think, are really versed in covering it completely. But I'm here to give you this overview tonight and to really share this event with you. My background is fire protection engineering, working at the National Fire Protection Association and the Fire Protection Research Foundation. And so that's my strength. But when it gets into medical and legal and certain other issues, I suspect that some of you in the audience here tonight are perhaps more tuned in. And again, we would encourage you to share that information with us later. So without further ado, let's step right into this and talk about the Coconut Grove fire. And just to do that, I want to bring us back into 1942, the city of Boston, Massachusetts, United States. And what was really happening at that time? Well, it was the height of World War II in many ways. In fact, Pearl Harbor was almost a year earlier, just prior to the 1-year anniversary, and the Allies had seen a number of setbacks. But during the year of 1942, with the Battle of Midway and Coral Sea and some other events, things were starting to change. The tide was turning, and it certainly, with the U.S. entering the war, it was a world war at that point, and so it was a very different time. And so here we are in the Film District, as they called it, section of Boston. And in the streets, and I'll go over this in a little bit more detail, they've changed quite a bit in the years, but some of these buildings are still there today. Well, so when you look back and you see what was life like in 1942, we think of some of the movies that were popular at the time, like Road to Morocco, and I believe that was when Bambi came out from Disney. It was one of their first films. Casablanca, Yankee Doodle Dandy. Bing Crosby was big at that time with White Christmas. So some of you, hopefully that's things that you do remember. The cost of living, of course, was very different back then. Cost of a new house, $3,700, something like that. So it was a different time, and in many ways, life was simpler. And one of the big points of recreation that people engaged in was going out to nightclubs and to theater and so forth. And the Coconut Grove nightclub was no different in the shows that were there. It was the hot spot at that time in the city of Boston, and was always had a good crowd in terms of its attendance. And with the Coconut Grove, and as you can see some of these before pictures, it had this friendly atmosphere with the palm trees in this grove kind of feeling. Now, one of the other things, as we look at 1942, and especially November, that was a huge sports day in the city of Boston. The Boston College Eagles were favored something in this enormous ratio to play their last game of the year with Holy Cross, and were undefeated, whereas Holy Cross had a balance of wins and losses. And interestingly, the program that day had the two captains of the Boston College football team on it, number 55 and number 12, which ended up being the final score of the game, except it was in Holy Cross's favor. It was one of the huge upsets in college football history that's been sort of forgotten because of the events that happened later that day. But where it ties into this story of the Cocoanut Grove is they were planning to have their celebration party that night at the Cocoanut Grove. Mayor Tobin himself was going to lead this celebration. Well, that changed completely. And for a lot of people, there were some people who still went because they were meeting other people and so forth. But the crowd changed. It was different people there. Some who were going to go didn't go, and vice versa. Now other people were there. So it's a good example of how certain events can really change. Who ended up being in the Grove that night and who wasn't. So this particular illustration was when we published our article in our journal, NFPA journal, for our membership back in 2007. And it shows clearly how the streets have changed. And there's a couple of things I do want to point out here for those of you who see this. And I'm not sure it's still a Radisson hotel. It might have even changed to something else. It is still Radisson, yeah. But it's a very large structure, and this lower portion is the concrete parking garage. Well, the Cocoanut Grove, the footprint for the building was really what you see here, and it was quite small. In fact, the one thing that we hear in some of these major disasters, like the Cocoanut Grove, we hear this from the firefighters and survivors and others, they cannot believe that there were that many people in the building in the first place. It was such a small building, comparatively speaking. So it really occupied a very small area of footprint. The other thing I want to point out, there are some buildings that were there then that are still here today. So you can actually go down and you can really locate based on this, where these buildings are located. You can actually go, if you stand at this corner of Shawmut Street and Piedmont Street, where it now intersects, really where the revolving door was right in the middle of that intersection on that sidewalk. So that's how the streets have changed and really made it a bit difficult to even find that original place. You can get on there and find the plaque that's there today. Now, also stepping back, this was as we look at the city of Boston at that time, and we realized that the Boston Fire Department was in mourning 2 weeks earlier. On that previous Saturday, 2 weeks before, was the Maverick Square fire that killed 6 Boston firefighters. 1 week before was this massive civil defense drill that was done by the civil defense in preparation as part of the wartime preparations, and involved, it's stated, upwards of 30,000 people directly and indirectly in this drill, which was a massive drill. But one of the things that played out is some of the items that they worked on during that civil defense drill the week before ended up getting put into action 1 week later on November 28th, 1942. So this is where we were in the city of Boston at that time and what was happening. People were heading off to war. Boston was a very busy place in terms of a lot of coming and going, a lot of different people there. So now let's talk about the fire itself and the event. And I want to switch now, and I'm starting this from the perspective of a firefighter. My involvement in this whole issue goes back to 1991 when I wrote an article and I went and I interviewed a number of individuals who were directly involved in the fire in one way, shape, or another. That included an employee, a firefighter, a serviceman, a doctor in charge of the emergency room, and others. And so we brought all their perspectives together and published that article. And one of those people that I interviewed, the late Red Graney, was on Engine Company 35 that responded to the fire. Now, this is an illustration of the Cocoanut Grove, and it really is a amalgamation of multiple smaller buildings that had been renovated and brought together, and which included this end where the Melody Lounge was down below in the lower area, above the coat room. Above it was the coat room area and the restrooms. The main dance floor, which had the retractable roof and the rolling stage that would roll out. And then the new additions, these were taller structures, by the way, up this end, but they were only using the first floor. And primarily down here was the new cocktail lounge, the Broadway Street cocktail lounge that they had up that end. And so really the primary ways in were through the revolving door over on Piedmont Street. That was the primary way in. Now there were exits in this facility, but all of them had something functionally wrong, and I'll talk about that later. But there was an exit door at the top of the Melody Lounge stairs on the first floor level. There were exit doors over here on Shawmut Street, some larger exit doors. There were some doors behind these service access ways. And then finally down at the Broadway Street Lounge, there was a large door there, all of them of which had something functionally wrong based on how we look at codes and standards today. So what happened here? Well, in terms of the fire department, they received a call. There was an alarm box 1514 came in for a car fire, and it was located at Stewart and Carter Street. So they responded, in my story talking about Red Graney, he was on engine 35 at the time, and they responded to that car fire. And it was an actual car fire. It was in the back seats. They thought it was started by a cigarette or whatever, and they extinguished that fire. That came in at 10:15. Well, while they were around the corner, somewhere not far removed from where the perspective is from this photo, they saw a commotion. There were people hollering and screaming, and they said, "Hey, what's going on over there?" And they came over. So the fire department was literally on the scene while this was taking place. And so they came over, and people were flooding out. They could see the fire, and they realized they had an issue immediately, and they could really take in the gravity of this thing was extremely serious. And District Chief Daniel Crowley, who was in charge, he immediately ordered one of the firefighters to go to the nearby fire alarm box, 1521, skip a second alarm, strike a third alarm. 1 minute later, told them to strike a fourth alarm. They wanted as much resource there as quick as possible. They realized they had a very serious event unfolding right before them. The fact that the fire department responded to this fire and literally was there, well, calls, were starting to come in as well to fire alarm, but they were there. That was of monumental importance. It takes away that question about, well, what if the fire department had gotten there earlier? Well, we see that this fire progressed so rapidly, and there were other problems with exits and other issues, that we still lost half of the people who were in the building that night. Now, when you step back and you realize the occupancy of the Coconut Grove that night was far exceeded, estimated between 25 to 50% in excess of its capacity. But there were close to 1,000 people at the Coconut Grove that night, and the ratio of survivors to fatalities to injuries was really backwards from what it is in most disasters. Usually there's a small percentage of people who are killed, and then a slightly larger percentage, but still small percentage of people who are injured, and then most people survive. Well, this was backwards. For every 4 people who were in the Coconut Grove that night, only 1 of those 4 would get out more or less untouched. One of those other people would be injured, and then 2 of them would die. So that was the ratio of the people that were there in the Coconut Grove that evening. So the fire department, upon arriving at the scene, their work was not as much dealing with the fire. As far as a fire itself, it wasn't that big of a fire for them. I mean, if this was an empty warehouse, they would have taken care of this in no time. It was really dealing with the human wreckage and the carnage. This was a really unique event, and even for them to attack and fight the fire and get water on the fire was a problem because the people were trying to get out, and the rescue was, of course, of paramount concern. But nevertheless, the fact that the resources that for the fire department were there was extremely important. And I want to point out that one of the other authors, Charlie Kenny III, his grandfather, and that's what the book is about, when I talked with Charlie Kenny Jr., well, their grandfather was on Rescue 1, and they were first at the scene as well. And one of the most poignant second-hand, actually third-hand stories that I've ever heard was Charlie Kenny telling me that when he visited his father in the hospital, because he was one of the few firefighters that was seriously injured at the event. No firefighters were killed at the Coconut Grove fire, but he was one that was hospitalized. Well, when he went and visited him the next day, he was showing him the claw marks on his legs. So I found that as a very striking testimony to what people were really going through. So for the fire department, they were there quickly. There was a lot of work. Of course, there were many others who were doing the work assisting the fire department in terms of rescue. There was, overall, there were 5 alarms sounded for this fire, which brought 25 engines, 5 ladders, 1 water tower, 1 rescue, other special utility units, and so forth. But they had the resources they need. It really was an event that unfolded so rapidly that even with them on the scene, had that characteristic. So now I want to switch and talk about not so much just the firefighter, but the overall incident command and those who are in charge, and provide a little bit of their perspective. And I believe when I was mentioning earlier, I'm not sure, did I mention Paul Christian was part of our group in 2007 as well? And he provided this perspective on the incident command and the commander's perspective as a former commissioner of the Boston Fire Department. But one of the things that's quite noteworthy, and this, by the way, is a very rare photo of the fire because you see smoke. If you look at most of the photographs of the Coconut Grove fire, you don't see smoke or fire because really that got knocked down quite quickly, and that event unfolded so rapidly in terms of the fire itself. But so soon after, you know, it was really, again, the work of trying to take care of the people and to move them out and to get them out and to perform the rescue that was needed. Now, one of the issues in the profession of firefighting, we talk about the National Incident Management System. They call it NIMS. And it's a very organized structure of who's in charge and who's doing what. And it's very carefully orchestrated at any fire ground in the United States of America. And it works very well. And, but one of the things that became apparent here is there are a lot of different people at this 1942 Coconut Grove fire of different rank. In fact, this is perhaps a classic of where the incident command, it never really became an issue, but was different than other events where it's very clear the fire chief is in charge. Because at this event, it turned out that Mayor Tobin was there. There was a fire commissioner, the police commissioner, the superintendent of police, the state fire marshal was there on scene, the acting commissioner of public safety, the director of Boston Committee on Public Safety, the military had all their units and their representatives, the Red Cross, Salvation Army, the list goes on and on. There were a lot of representatives, so that fortunately this never really came into play because it was very clear what needed to be done, and that was to rescue the people that were there. But in terms of, you know, this whole hierarchy of incident command, that is one of the issues. The other is that as they were sending the victims to the hospital, and trying to get them transported, and they were transporting them in every possible vehicle, they really discovered that they didn't have the transport they needed, and there weren't enough ambulances. They were moving them in private vehicles, newspaper delivery trucks were used, taxis, bringing people to the hospitals. And one of the things that happened is the diversion of most of the people heading to Boston City Hospital. And where that became an issue is that Boston City Hospital, they received over 300 of the victims were brought to Boston City Hospital. And even today, as I understand, it still rates as one of the highest admittance rates ever for a hospital, because you don't normally have this kind of influx of injured people. And they received, for 1 hour and 15 minutes, they received a person every 11 seconds. And that amounted to the over 300 individuals. When they realized this was an issue, this was a problem, people were lining the corridors, dying in the corridors, they diverted many of these to Mass General, which received the second biggest number of victims at 114, 39 of which were finally bedded down and survived to be treated, of which, of those 39 out of the 114, 7 of them died in the first 3 days, one of which was Buck Jones, the celebrated movie star in the cowboy era. So really trying to deal with the people was a problem, and they ended up using the garage, the parking garage across the street, as a temporary morgue to place the victims as they were bringing them out. They just didn't have a place to put them. And so that ended up being their primary triage point before transport to the hospitals. Now, I want to pause for a minute and switch into the medical side of this, because the Coconut Grove fire is really a milestone event in the work done in the medical field. And when you look at what has happened, remember, this is at the height of the wartime era. So there was a lot of work that was going on, and Dr. Oliver Koop at Mass General Hospital was working on what he had called the soft technique. And this was brought forth to try to help during the wartime effort in terms of what could be done to minimize burn injuries and make them heal faster and better. Well, it turned out the Coconut Grove fire pushed their research and their work. It really propelled that and made a big difference in terms of how those techniques, those burn injury techniques, were implemented throughout the rest of the war and elsewhere. So the big issues, as I've been told, is on the medical side, involves the surface and surgical management of burns, involves the fluid management, and that gets back to the plasma and that's provided for the victims in a burn incident. The respiratory management, and that's another issue that received a lot of focus. And the final of these was the infection. And clearly, in terms of the infection, they did use penicillin. There is some talk about that, but what I've been told is that they used it in dosages that were too small at that time, and we've since learned that the proper usage would involve more. But just stepping back for a second, the point about the respiratory management of that was an issue that was confounding the doctors initially, because there were victims who were coming into the hospital who were coming in, they seemingly didn't have anything wrong with them, except that they were agitated, and next thing, they were dying. And it turns out that there was severe pulmonary issues in some of these cases, and then there were questions about that there was something toxic that they may have been exposed to, and it raised questions on the similarities with the Cleveland Clinic fire that happened about a dozen years earlier, which killed 120-something or so individuals. And where the victims had been exposed to phosgene gas from X-ray films that had burned. And the question was, well, were these people exposed to anything? That's part of the mystery that still shrouds this overall event, and I'll talk about it in a bit more detail. So one of the issues here, even with any disaster of this magnitude, is how many people died. We talk about 492 individuals died in this event, and that's where the press and newspapers and so forth have settled on that number. However, if you go look at the official Boston Fire Department report, it talks about the list they provide of all the fatalities and all the injuries, which supersedes all other lists, and it has 490. And you realize that, well, wait a minute, and in the literature, if you look at Paul Benzequin's book or the Keyes book and so forth, you realize that, yeah, they didn't include Eleanor Powerwell, as I recall her name, who died at Boston City Hospital. And then there's questions even about including others who get into that gray area. There was Francis Gattarina from his wife perished in the fire. He was injured. He was released after a few days or a week or so, was very depressed, was readmitted to the hospital, and 6 weeks after the fire, he threw himself through a closed sixth-floor window in the hospital. And the question becomes, is he a victim or not? So there are stories here, and you see that you realize even counting the fatalities is a challenge in an event like this. It's not straightforward. So I want to now shift into a different direction, the legal community. And the Coconut Grove fire was indeed another event that marked a milestone for the professionals involved in litigation and legal activities. Now, immediately after the fire, there was a commission put together by Arthur Riley, the fire commissioner, to immediately, and they got this started within 24 hours. And their purpose was to really look closely at what the fire department activities had involved, which included not just their activities on the fire ground, but it included looking at their fire prevention activities, and that was looked at in significant detail with Lieutenant Frank Linney, who was the fire inspector who inspected the Coconut Grove 1 week before the fire and submitted a one-page report that indicated the conditions were, quote, good, and that there were no inflammable, quote, unquote, materials to be found. Well, that single-page report was published in its entirety on the front page of the newspapers. So immediately that was brought into full light, and the fire department was looking very closely at that. But in addition to that, there was a grand jury was assembled, and the district attorney and the others, they handed down indictments for this, the Coconut Grove fire. And 10 different individuals were indicted as a result of this fire. However, after the trial, and one of them, by the way, was Frank Linney, the fire inspector, 9 of them were found not guilty. One was found guilty, and that is Barney Walensky, the owner of the Coconut Grove. And so he was convicted of involuntary manslaughter. And this is a precedent-setting case that even today, if you go, you'll find this reference, for instance, on the BP oil spill, as an example, where it's asking the question about, being responsible for involuntary manslaughter. So it really does provide this legal precedent. Barney Walensky was convicted, sentenced to 12 to 15 years. He served 4 of them before he was pardoned because he had cancer. He was terminally ill. He was released. He told the reporters the day he was released that he wished he had died with the others in the fire. He lived 9 weeks after and then succumbed to the cancer. In this picture, this is the jury that's doing their site visit to the Coconut Grove. There were 400 civil suits that came out of this. Once all the assets were compiled and divided, the survivors and the victims' families each got $150 is what it all came down to that was available. Now, I want to talk about the cause and origin, and this is where our good friend Jack Deedy had helped us in 2007. And cause and origin, now there's a really interesting twist to this story. If you go and you pull the newspapers like we did out of the Boston Public Library, now you can clearly see how the editions were changing and rapidly updating and trying to reflect the numbers of how many dead were there really and so forth. But you do also notice that police say busboy's match caused fire. Boy admits starting fire. Well, this young man was crucified in the press, and so there's a lot of speculation about how did the fire start, who caused the fire. Well, I can tell you from fire professionals like myself, that's almost an academic point. We want to know, wait a minute, whether this is electrical short or whatever the issue, why did it spread so fast? How did those people not get out? If there was a fire here tonight, you see these exits here with emergency lighting, we have sprinklers, we have a lot of fire safety features built in here. What went wrong that allowed that to escalate to that point? So aside from the fact of that specific point of origin, there's a number of other issues, and I do want to tell you that as we look at other possibilities, there were significant other possibilities, such as the electrical wiring. And this came out not only during Commissioner Riley's investigation, but also during the grand jury inquiry, that there was certainly some other questionable points of ignition that were raised. So with that, there was the fire commissioner's report on this fire, and I quote, they indicate, first of all, in Riley's report, he says, quote, "I find no evidence of incendiarism," point number 1, and the most important of those 2 points, though, is, quote, "This fire will be entered in the records of the Department of Boston Fire Department as being of unknown origin. So the official cause of this fire is unknown. Now, there's a number of other things that I want to point out, and I'm going to just expand on it in a moment, but there are other issues here that raise some serious questions. And Charlie Kenny Jr. and Jack Deedy and a number of others who have been looking at this, there's this question about the methyl chloride used in the refrigerant. During wartime, you could not get the normal refrigerants like we have today that were, and the ones they were using at that time were flammable. And there were some questions about if there was a possible release. None of this ever was addressed during the official investigation. But it's noted that the compressor was actually down in the corner behind the wall where the Coconut Grove fire started. The point of origin was down here in the corner of the Melody Lounge in the basement. So, you know, what contribution did this or could this have possibly had? And that's part of the mystery of how this fire spread the way it did. Now, I do want to point out that if you look at down in the Melody Lounge, one of the things that becomes apparent is that, yes, there was plenty of fire damage, but there was also a lot of stuff that was left. This is the bar on the Melody Lounge. And from Daniel Weiss, who was the employee we investigated for our story that we wrote in 1991, he indicated that he was allowed to go back in the next day to retrieve the money from the cash registers, including down here. And it surprised him at how the ceiling area was burned, but much of the rest of the Melody Lounge actually didn't look that bad. So it's a point that it's not only what burned, but what didn't burn. And we realize that even in some cases, the palm frauds and so forth. Now, there's other questions that we step back as investigators 68 years later, and we realize that, wait a minute, there's some other questions here that are important to address. This is the Broadway Lounge, the new Broadway Lounge, and there's two pictures here, but really what is of importance is the ceiling. And you can't quite see it in this picture, but in the next picture it's a bit clearer. And here we see the telltale globs of glue on the ceiling. And these became a culprit in a series of fires during the late 40s and early 50s, where it became very noted that these asbestos ceiling tiles, 1 foot square ceiling tiles, which don't burn, well, they're glued up there with this glue. And that glue, if you go and you try to take these things down, you need a chisel to get those off. That glue hardens rock hard, unless you heat it. And when you heat it, guess what? It's flammable. It softens, the ceiling tiles drop down, you have a flammable ceiling. And so this was a discovery that they realized. And so the late Frank Brannigan wrote us after we published this picture, and he said, aha, the telltale globs of glue on the ceiling in the new Broadway Lounge. Well, one of the things I'm building up to here is there's a number of factors that really relate back into the mystery of why did this fire spread the way it did that evening. In Commissioner Riley's report, he talks about the fire traveling from the point of origin, 2 to 4 minutes. It traversed the Melody Lounge, built up its energy, and came up like a fireball up the stairs and out into the main foyer. And then 5 minutes, he estimates 5 minutes at most, it had traveled from that point of origin out the Broadway door. So the locomotive had really left the station, and it was really a significant amount of fire that was coming in an extremely short period of time. And so from the codes and standards standpoint, as we step back and we ask, so what really happened there? We see a tremendous amount of energy being released in a very short time period. And I can tell you that as hard as we work to make sure this kind of event doesn't happen again, it does happen again. It happened again in West Warwick, Rhode Island. And we struggle with that because how do we make sure that we don't have this kind of event happen again? It happened again in the Happy Land Social Club in New York City. It happened again in the Cro-Magnon nightclub in Brazil, in the recent fire in Bangkok, and the Gothenburg disco in Sweden. So we know that these fires happen, and we work hard to try to prevent them. But this is where the challenge is truly in front of us. Now, at the Coconut Grove that night, there were a number of main ways out of the building. There were 4 key spots out of the building, every one of those spots had something functionally wrong, so that if you were in there that night, then you were going to have a problem getting out. So that even as you look at the main entrance here, coming out of the main foyer into the building, if you look closely, you can still see the rod here for the revolving door, that infamous revolving door. Well, I can tell you, at the time, the fire protection community with the life safety code, which is really what we use, it's a backbone of all our building codes today, it was already in existence. A lot of places weren't following it. And one of the things, it was already very clear that you have flanking doors on any revolving door. Now, one of the key problems with nightclubs is they were exempt as a place of assembly in the building code at the time. So we realized, well, wait a minute, how could that even be? I mean, you know, a place of assembly, isn't that like a nightclub? People get together. Well, yeah, except as a carryover from Prohibition and sort of all the political inties and things that happened, it was sort of not written in as a place of assembly. So in the city of Boston, the Coconut Grove was not a place of assembly at that time. So there were different requirements that they had to stick to, but you also find that as you look at every one of the ways out of here, there was something wrong with that. Now here's the top of the stairs to the Melody Lounge. I mean, this is, if it's standing at the corner, back, the person's back who took this picture has the restrooms right behind them, and they're looking out the door. This is the door out to the street. The stairway down to the Melody Lounge is right there, and it goes down on the left, heads out on the left, down those stairs. Well, here's the door. Well, that door, that was fully equipped with panic hardware, as you see here. The problem is it was bolted shut in 2 spots. And so when the fire department did finally prop this open and get it open, it was piled chest high with people who had perished at this point. The door at the Broadway Street Lounge, it swung inward. It was, you know, these are just such basic issues. And the Coconut Grove had something functionally wrong with all those ways out of that building that night. And further, the main doors, the big doors that they had on Shawmut Street, they were bolted shut. What happened is one of the busboys got it open, and that ended up saving quite a few people, getting those doors open. So we realized that you cannot have an event like this and really, you know, you need to get the people out in the time period necessary. And further, you know, we step back today from the investigation community and we ask the question, what really happened at the Coconut Grove? And it is a bit of a mystery. We're able to look at events like the Station Nightclub. We have, you know, the video record, which is an extremely powerful tool for us because we can use that against the fire models, and we can see that between the 80 and 90-second period from when the ignition started from the gerb, we can see that the temperature, according to the computer models, went from about 200 degrees at the 5-foot level to over 1,000 degrees. And really what's happening is, I'm back to that point about the train has left the station. Once that fire gets underway and it's increasing at that kind of heat release rate, it's too quick. And so the station, it was 80 to 90 seconds. So we step back and we say something similar happened here at the Coconut Grove. Something really propelled that fire and really got it moving through there, and there was no way for the people to get out in this overcrowded facility. So as we wrap this up, I know I step back and I look at disasters like this and I realize that almost 500 people perished in this event, and it touched many, many people. Here we are 68 years later and we're still talking about this. It's a very important issue to many people. Well, I like to think that those people who suffered and those people who died that evening in November 1942, that they did not do so in vain, that all the advances that we've made because of this, not even in just the fire protection community, but in the medical community and elsewhere, that they did not die in vain, and that we've made the advances and prevented others from suffering similar fate. So that's it for me. Thank you.
And now I would like to invite those who have a question, if you could please proceed to the mic, and we'll start getting that going. And I'll maybe get things started by asking just one question to get things going about the knowledge that those revolving doors were a safety hazard, but they were not that was not being enforced? Was that in other areas other than just the Coconut Grove, or other places have revolving doors without the flank doors at that point?
There were, and you can still hear me, right? Okay. Yeah. In fact, there were other places that had the revolving doors, including City Hall, and the story is told of how they were removed immediately after, and gets back to having the proper exits and the flanking doors. We have revolving doors today, but you'll always notice about the flanking doors with them. And further, they're supposed to be of the collapsible type, but the exits, any building will have its exit size, so to make sure that the capacity of those people can get through those exits, get down the means of exits and the discharge and so forth in the time period needed. I do want to point out that we also have with us my colleague from National Fire Protection Association, Bob Duvall in the back, who is also deeply familiar with the codes and standards as well.
Great. Question over here?
Sure. Hi, thanks again, Casey. Yeah, my name is Ralph McGilvery, and this has fascinated me all my life. And I have a couple of questions that I'd like to follow up with something, a couple of initial questions. You answered tonight one of them, but I had seen before the exact location of the compressor room. That was one of the things I wanted to know. The other one I'm not sure about is, do you know where the exact location of the power panel was that caused the lights to fail?
So the question is the location of the power panel, the electrical power panel.
Exactly, yeah.
And I don't specifically recall where that is. I believe it was in the basement. But there is a lot about the electrical system in the building, and especially with the renovations and the multiple buildings that were put together to form the Coconut Grove. But one of the key issues that happened as well, aside from the possibility of a point of ignition possibility, was the fact that the lights went out. They went out early in the event, and this was another thing that came out of the Coconut Grove fire in terms of changes in the codes and standards. These exit signs that you see around here on a separate system, a separate electrical system with battery backup power, that they do not go out in an event. But as far as the exact location of the panel itself, I have to tell you, at NFPA in our files, we do have the blueprints of the building. So it's interesting to take a look at that if that's something you'd ever want to see.
Oh, yeah, to follow up, the reason I asked that, I thought I had read someplace in one of the books that an attempt was made to, get the roof open, the automated roof, and of course they couldn't do it. But I thought they said they tried to do that from a power panel somewhere behind the stage.
Yeah, as far as there was a retractable roof, and the question about attempts to open it, the firefighters who I spoke with, they never addressed that, and I have heard stories about possible attempts to try to do that were unsuccessful, but I've never been able to confirm that. And indeed, as the event was unfolding, I guess I stepped back and I think that by the time the fire department was really getting in there, I mean, they were already knocking down the fire, and it was really just pulling the people out. So timeline-wise, I'm not sure how that would have impacted if they could have done it.
Well, the reason why I say this, and I'd like you to comment on my theory, it's my contention that the door at the top of the stairs from the Melody Lounge with a panic bar, that's huge, huge, much bigger even than any book I've read. I know a little bit from my background about fires and combustion. If that door had opened when people were trying to come up from the Melody Lounge, maybe more would have perished in Melody Lounge, because that would have been like a blowtorch. But that would have slowed down the spread of that fire tremendously. And especially if the power panel was upstairs, the lights would have stayed on much longer and a panic wouldn't ensue the way it did.
Well, yes, and your point is well taken about for instance, if that door at the top of the Melody Lounge had opened, one of the clear things we see with the fire models that we use today, it completely changes the dynamics of the fire in terms of the ventilation characteristics.
Exactly.
And you're right, it would have been a very different scenario. There still would have been a large loss of life, but it would have been very different, and a lot of those people and the rest of the facility would not have been impacted the way it was. That fire had nowhere to go but all the way to the other end.
Exactly.
And just really go through the crowd of people.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kevin. I just had a question about the way the people actually perished. Do they know if it was from actual fire, was it from the heat, or was it from other causes being trampled, for example?
That's a really good question about how the victims perished. And it was a mix, because when you go and you read the literature, not only in terms of the rescuers and how they were finding people and their personal accounts, but also in the hospitals where they were finding people that were severely burned, but some with no burns who were actually perishing, and then they realizing that it was this respiratory damage that they had suffered, and as well as other questions about possible toxic gas and so forth. But the firefighters, when you read the stories, for instance, they'll tell you that some of the people, and one of the stories is about John Collins, who was one of the people that we interviewed. And he talks about when he was one of the first firefighters down into the Melody Lounge, and there was a very pretty girl, he says, sitting there, and he's like, well, what are you doing here? And he realized that she was sitting at the table, but she was dead. And somehow she had died, but seemingly untouched. And so there was a complete mix of people, some who had serious burns and some who had respiratory issues and so forth. There were very few, the reports from the medical side, no reports of broken bones. And so in terms of crowd crush and other issues like that, that didn't seem to be a factor.
Thank you.
Stephanie, Mr. Casey, thank you for this presentation this evening. I have a very definite interest in the Coconut Grove, as I was there the next morning. This was before the days of TV. We heard the news on the radio. My father was a fire captain. He said, let's go. I was 10 years old. We went into the Coconut Grove. He found it. And this was before the days of the yellow tape. They had these wooden barriers. So two of us were standing there. The barriers were set back. And a police officer came by. My father was talking to him. And he found out he was a fire captain. And he says, well, come on in. So we went right over to the front revolving doors, both doors around the side, looked in, all the bodies had been removed. But it made a lasting impression, and I've never forgotten it. And I appreciate your presentation this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Could you just state your name for the record, please? Thanks.
Frank Fitzgerald, Malden Fire Department Chief, retired.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Chief.
Could you put it in the mic right here? Yes. Excellent, thank you.
My name is Rick Winterson, born and brought up in the suburbs, living in Belmont at the time of the fire. I'm 74, I was 6 at that time, and a Mr. Carl H. Thorne lost his life in the fire. He was my father's boss at the old U.S. Trust, which was here at 30 Court Street, where the Ocean Air restaurant is now. And I remember the Sunday night, the word came in from the officials of the bank. Mr. Thorne was a vice president, and at 3 in the morning, Monday morning, workday, my father got the word. The phone was right outside my bedroom, and I remember him yelling in grief. My mother came out to comfort him, and it was, oh my God, not Carl, not Carl. And Monday morning, of course, there was the Post headline, November 28th, 397 dead, and the counting hadn't yet finished. And I interviewed some Suffolk students tonight who were doing a history paper on the fire, and I looked up, you can Google it up. I remember that Post headline like it was yesterday, and I Googled up the Post headline and just felt the vibration, November 28th, you know. And my father didn't want to take Mr. Thorne's job because it was right out of the recession at that time. And the protocol is you didn't take any man's job, no matter what, because of the unemployment that pertained at the time. And I recognize my memories are somewhat on the childish side, 6 years old, and but it's still very vivid in my mind and affected my family very directly. and Mr. Thorne was a good friend, so thank you.
I'm from New Jersey, and I found out about this fire as a child when I was reading, I think it was Life magazine or Look magazine, that had a spread that really highlighted the heroic nature of the medical community as they tried to deal with the burns. And the story featured, I think it was a sailor who was severely burned, and they were trying, of course, all kinds of new techniques to try to solve the problems of the massive burns that occurred. And the irony of the story, as I remember, and the memory still sticks with me today, is this sailor eventually recovered and went back to Iowa and started a farm. And ironically, one day he was plowing his field and his tractor tipped over and the gasoline spilled out and he was burned to death. And I just was struck by the irony of that, the heroic efforts of the medical community and how fickle fate can be sometimes for us. But I really appreciate your presentation tonight. It was very eye-opening. Thank you.
Yeah, just to follow up quickly, I don't recall his name, but it was a Coast Guardsman, but your story is correct, and that was another medical milestone, as he was burned over the percentage of his body more than anyone else had ever been and survived. And he was at Boston City Hospital and was really a remarkable case out of the whole Coconut Grove incident, and again, part of the whole medical milestone that was set.
I believe his name was Clifford Johnson, as I recall, and yeah, his is a really amazing story of survival. His was a really amazing story of survival, and yet with a very tragic ending.
My name is John Radigan. It was a very interesting presentation. I think every Boston family has a story, and in my family there were a couple, and obviously it's second-hand information, but in 1942 my father was a resident at Boston City Hospital, and on that night he and my mother had intended to go to the Coconut Grove to attend the Boston College victory celebration, which was canceled, as you said, because of the loss. So they decided to have a quiet dinner at a hotel dining room, which some 30 years later was the site of another tragic fire, the Hotel Vendôme. And after dinner, they came out and they could hear the sirens screaming, and the doorman told them that there was a bad fire at the Grove. So my father said, well, perhaps I better check in at the hospital. And the doorman said, if you're a doctor, they're calling all the doctors in. So he and my mother went down just to check in, and she was in the waiting area and watching one body after another being brought in. And she was about 2 months pregnant, and in the middle of all this, she fainted. And with all the chaos, the nurses had to revive her and put her in a cab, sent her home. My father didn't come home for 3 days after that. 2 of his patients were a college classmate at Boston College and his wife, who were badly burned but did survive, who did go to the Grove that evening. And my father's brother was a parish priest in South Boston, and one of the firehouses down there stopped at the St. Monica's and took him aboard to administer last rites, and which he did. And his one memory was that the number of very young women who all had engagement rings, not wedding bands, but this was the first year of the war, and many engagements took place, and that was his one memory. So, as I said, every family has these memories, but thank you.
Yeah. That's good.
Thank you so much for that memory.
My name is Sean Colby. I'm a member of the Boston Fire Department. I had a quick question. You touched briefly on the busboy, Stanley Tomaszewski, who obviously lit the match, which I don't know if you talked about the background story with that. He was lighting the match to screw a light bulb back in that somebody had unscrewed to, have some privacy with their date. Was it ever studied during the inquiry whether or not that with the faulty wiring inside the club, that simply screwing that light bulb back in could have caused the short circuit that had ultimately caused the fire, and whether or not that if that incident had never happened, that perhaps the fire had never happened? I've never read anything about that, so I was just curious.
Well, yes, and you sort of explained it as you asked it, and it did come out during the inquiry that there were all kinds of questions, like the electrical wiring, and, well, wait a minute, if the match did touch something, yeah, maybe that got things started. But what if it was the electrical wiring, and that was unclear in terms of what role the electrical wiring might have had. But there was also the question about, okay, well, even aside from the fact that it was a match or a spark or whatever it was, why did it just take off the way it did? I mean, that was the bigger mystery. And really the concern on the professional side, it's like, that just shouldn't happen. Just like at the station fire, it was like, we knew it was the acoustical interior foam and so forth. But what was it at the Coconut Grove? And that is a mystery today. So it is a mystery as well in terms of the exact point of ignition still. And unfortunately, that young man was sort of again found guilty in the press, but he was it was never clear what that actual single point of ignition was that evening.
I just have one more question. Do I remember reading correctly that they supposedly found nothing wrong with the wiring after the fire, or nothing that could have possibly caused the fire, even though we obviously know that it was, illegally?
Yeah, there were things found improper and not correct with the wiring. So yeah, there were problems with the wiring.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues was there as thorough an investigation as there might be today, and that I think is another one of the unanswered questions about the fire and how it started and how it spread so quickly. Just one. Oh, we have one over here.
Thank you. I'm just curious if the point of origin we're thinking is pretty much where that busboy had the match. Oh, right at the mouth. Okay. If the busboy had the match, so the point of origin is presumably where he is, near the compressor room, how did he get out? Because most of the people I understand didn't make it out of the Melody Room, right?
That's not entirely true. The people, in terms of the people who escaped from the Melody Lounge, there were a number of people who were killed who went up the stairs, because that was the obvious way out, going out the way you came in, and they perished because they ran into the roadblock of all the other people up there. And the only ways out once you got at the top of the stairs were the locked exit or the revolving door. However, there were people who didn't go that way. They went into the kitchen. They went in through the basement. And in fact, Daniel Weiss, who we interviewed for our 1991 article, who became a well-known psychiatric doctor in the Boston area for years, he was tending the cash register at the bar. When the fire occurred, his primary job is to protect the cash register. He's not supposed to leave it during a fight or whatever, because that, sometimes is what they cause a commotion just to get the cash register. So he stayed. Well, it turned out when the fire was really underway, there was no way he was going to get out. He got a wet rag, he got down on the floor, and he stayed until it just got quiet. And he could hear noise in the distance, but it got very quiet in the Melody Lounge. And then he waited, and then he jumped over the bar, stayed low on the floor, and crawled into the kitchen, and escaped with other people who had gone into the kitchen. So there were people who did survive in the Melody Lounge at night and went out through that way, and then eventually did get out of the basement. I assume, I don't know exactly his way out, but I'm assuming that it was something similar.
Yeah, I think it was something like that. I think he escaped with some of the other employees because they knew of the other ways out through the kitchen area. the patrons of the bar, the only exit they knew was where they came in, which is the revolving door, and they headed back in that direction. Whereas many of the staff went into the kitchen and went in that direction, and many survived. Many did not survive, but many did survive going in that direction. This points out that the fire was a little bit arbitrary in terms of who lived and who died.
And I do want to just add one additional point here, is that in the way that codes are set up, even then, but today as well, that every point that is a place of assembly or where public people can gather like we are here, there was always at least 2 completely independent ways that you can get out, and they have to be made known and so forth. Well, once again, the Coconut Grove didn't have that. For those patrons, it was that just going up the stairs, that's all they knew.
The door at the top of the stairs, the Melody Lounge, I've heard that there were doors that were locked.
Yes, the door was locked. That was the picture I showed at the end of the presentation, correct. It had the panic hardware on it, but it was bolted shut in 2 spots. And this gets back to part of the guilt of the owner and others. Well, the owner primarily was the only one convicted in involuntary manslaughter, but you know, they had locked it to keep people from leaving without paying their bill.
I just have a very short story to tell. When I was a little girl when that fire happened, I was 4 years old, and we were living nearby at that time. So my mother took me by the hand because she wanted to go see the ruins. By then, the fire was out. So I was with her, and we walked there. And even though I was just a little girl, I knew something bad had happened, you know, just by looking at the ruins. You just knew, even though you were a little kid. But I have also a question. You mentioned the glue in the ceiling, but you didn't mention other causes. For example, they had that artificial leather covering the walls and the furniture. I forgot what it's called. Is it called Olean?
They were calling it leatherette.
Yeah, whatever they called it. I was under the impression they discovered that was part of what caused that situation, the fumes from that.
Yes.
And is it true that the stuff that was in that was also used in hand grenades?
Well, okay, I cannot confirm that last point, but I can tell you that the leatherette was something that was looked at after the fire, and the materials in the Grove were of concern, and it gets back to even, I mentioned about how Fire Inspector Lieutenant Frank Linney had done his inspection. Well, part of that inspection, including taking a piece of that material, going out and trying to light it with a match, and it wouldn't light. But today, we realize that that's not the kind of procedure that is used. All the materials that are in a building, like we're in now, go through these rigorous tests to determine not simply how easily they ignite, but what happens. There's materials that are very hard to ignite, but once they get going, they produce very dangerous materials.
I'm talking about the fumes that were caused by that leatherette, the actual fumes.
Well, that's what I'm pointing out right now, is that there are materials like the leatherette is suspicious of being that kind of material. Once they do get ignited, they burn ferociously and they give off very dangerous products of combustion. And the thinking is that the leatherette and possibly other materials did have that contribution to the fire.
Yeah, because I think it's a very complicated fire. I think there's too many things that could and would have happened, so it's not easy to pinpoint them.
And I agree with you that it is a very complicated fire in terms of how that fire grew the way it did. On the other hand, the exits were not as complicated.
The billowing satin fabric that was on the ceilings, there was a dead spot between the actual ceiling and the fabric, and some think that also caused the fire to move faster. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, those are all possibilities, and certainly there's other issues. One of the things that we heard from patrons who survived talked about the walls being warm. That it was even though it was cold outside, it was very warm inside. We know that when we do fire modeling, for instance, that does that is a stimulant. There are the issues in terms of the air being dry or humid, make a big difference. And so whatever happened that night in the Coconut Grove, it all came together in the worst way to create the most extreme conditions in a very short time in the most incredibly overcrowded spot like that.
So I read that it took maybe 12 to 15 minutes the most for that fire to start in the Melody and go all the way through that whole place.
And
Is that
I don't know if you want to
sensible?
add anything, but just the Fire Commissioner Riley's report talks about 5 minutes.
5 minutes, wow.
It was a very short period of time. I think Benzoquin said 12 minutes. Other estimates put it from anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. So it was extremely quickly. I want to add one thing something, Casey, you once told me when you were helping me in my research. You said this was the perfect storm of a fire, which I think which was a metaphor that stayed with me, that so many parts came together to play a part in the destruction and then in the way that people could not get out of the building. Which I think is another part of the story of the fire. And one thing about, you mentioned the leatherette, there was some feeling about that some of the chemicals in the leatherette, when it burned, created sort of a mustard gas kind of effect. And I think that's where the grenade issue came in, that it was more of that kind of thing. There is some dispute about how, the material was clearly toxic. Barbara Ravage in her book talks about, well, was it a mystery gas the way many people believed it, or is it just something that with this huge combustion, so many things getting burned, if this was creating something that it was just a really, really bad conditions for your lungs as well.
If that same exact type fire happened today, with all we know, would they be better able to figure out what happened, do you think?
Absolutely. Our tools for fire investigation today are much more advanced and much better.
Actually, Casey, that's a question I've always wondered is could we ever do some computer modeling on the Coconut Grove? I think I've talked to you about this before, but is there any chance that we could actually come up with an answer? Or is it just always going to remain a mystery?
Well, it is something that we've thought about, and even the articles that were published by Doug Beller and some other individuals have toyed with the idea. One of the problems is that the inputs that we'd really need, a lot of the inputs and the variables, we wouldn't have them, and there'd be a lot of speculation on things like what was the humidity, what were, some of these sensitive elements that, the materials. So we could still, I still hope that someday that can be done, but.
Brief comment and question. One of the interesting things, like that gentleman was saying over there, my grandparents were actually at the Boston College Holy Cross game that night, and they intended to go to the Coconut Grove, but since Boston College lost, ended up changing their plans. My father was born 3 years later, so in many ways, if it weren't for that Boston College loss, I wouldn't be here today. My question is actually just, what became of the busboy after everything happened? I know you said that he was kind of crucified in the press. Was it soon after that they started throwing around ulterior theories, or was he kind of the scapegoat for a while?
Yeah, and that's a really good question you're asking, and I'll respond. I don't know if you want to add to it, but it was a very challenging and difficult thing for him to live with, and he did stay in the Boston area. He did die a few years ago, but I understand that he was chased about this right to the very end, and even immediately after the fire, they had to have police details in terms of protecting him and his family where they lived. So it really was it really changed his life. And even though he was, that was never confirmed or.
He was only, I believe, 17 at the time of the fire, and he was supporting his mother, was widowed, so he was supporting his mother. The police were very impressed with him. He was at some initial hesitation, he was very forthright about what happened. So the tendency was to say that he could not have been responsible for it, but he did pay a price for it, and in, I think, one of the articles before he died, he was still getting calls in the middle of the night telling him he was a murderer for what he'd done. So he lived with that all his life. Again, in a way, he was another victim of the fire as well.
And if I could add one additional thing, I didn't show the newspaper articles, but if you go and you pull them, and we have them at our NFPA library, for instance, it's remarkable just looking at the headlines alone, because you can see where they first came out with these big blaring headlines, busboys match starts fire. Well, 3 or 4 days later, after there's riots down on where this poor young man lives, they're coming up with the stories that say, the mother says, my Stanley's a good boy, and they're trying to kind of reverse what they inadvertently created, and you can see it in the headlines itself.
Thank you. I don't want to get into the whole story of my father. My father was a survivor of the fire. He was in the band, and my father was a survivor of the fire. He was in the band, and 2 points. Number one, what you said about people working there getting out, they knew the way in and out. That's how he got out. He went down the service entrance through the kitchen. And once again, I don't want to get into the whole story of this because it's really not relevant to tonight. But he was responsible for saving some lives. Thing that did come out of this fire, though, that my mother and he lived with up until the ripe old age of 93 was the post-traumatic stress. He was a man, you never got any information. If you interviewed him for this, he wouldn't talk about it. He might have known some things that may have been helpful for whatever. He lived his whole life post-traumatic stress, and I think the post-traumatic stress syndrome definitely was helped as a result of this fire. Another positive that came out of a very terrible experience. So that I don't want to get into the whole story because it's too long. I don't think people this hour want to hear about it. So, but that's it. The post-traumatic stress, though, is an important thing that did come out of this fire.
Yeah.
That indeed was one important point, and some of the original studies of survivor guilt, the psychological research, which we didn't even get into tonight, a lot of that psychological research started with interviews with the Coconut Grove survivors, and yes, there was some good coming out of that.
Yeah, I don't want to take up much more of your time. I just have a couple of more quick questions. Number one, I meant to ask when I first hit the microphone. Do you know, you mentioned where the compressor room was. Were the refrigerant lines going up, to get the refrigerator up across the ceiling? Or how did they run? Did anyone ever ascertain that?
I don't know. I know that there was some research done with this, and it goes back to an article that's published in NFPA Journal in 2000, I think it was published by Doug Beller, where he was trying to work on this in support of Charlie Kenny Jr. and Jack Deedy and a number of others who actually had come across some additional information about the compressor and actually had a witness who had brought it to their facility and so forth. But as far as, I don't personally know that information, but others may.
Thank you. My other question was, I think I read that Inspector Linney was never actually fired. He was shifted to another position in the fire department. Is that true?
And I don't personally know what happened to Lieutenant Linney after that. He was a firefighter who had a number of commendations for heroism. And really, what this story is a fire inspector's worst nightmare. I mean, they're out there following their procedures, and I personally think fire inspectors, even today, have one of the toughest jobs in the world, because they're here to make our lives safe, but yet they have to do that by telling people, hey, do this, do that, and they don't like it. And sometimes it means, telling the Boston Symphony Orchestra that, hey, you can't have people sitting in the aisles like this. Stop your show. And they have the power to do that. And so, it raises the question about them trying to be, the good public servant. And every once in a while, fire inspector like Frank Linney gets caught in, this kind of awful thing. And
yeah, but I mean, excuse me, I'm sorry. I just going to, in this case, it seems so blatant. I mean, you had two known escape routes, the revolving door and the one at the top of the Melting Lounge. And the way I read it, that wasn't just something where you threw a deadbolt and it locked and then you unlocked it. That thing was permanently bolted shut. Now, I mean, how does a fire inspector let something like that get by? Thank you.
My name is Henry Lee. I can't add anything to the story of Coconut Grove, but life does take funny turns, and I think all of you would share in my feelings because I was in the Coconut Grove the night before, and I was there for quite a long time with two friends. And we did not go on Saturday because I had to go to a family party. So we went on Friday. And I can remember, of course, it's the kind of thing you might think you remember, but I actually did remember sitting there and thinking how enormously crowded it was. And what if something really happened here? How would we ever get out? And the next day, of course, I read in the paper what had happened. And all my life, I've thought how fortunate I was by just 24 hours.
Thank you so much for sharing. And before you leave, we'd like to get your name and number because we'd love to hear your description of what the club was like as well, because I think that would help to add to our knowledge of that.